Hi everyone and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how to make your very own puff pastry. And this is very simple and you see that only the ingredients that I just shared with you on the screen are the ones that you're going to be needing. So this is butter, some water, flour, and a little bit of salt. So it's just a handful of things that are most likely already sitting in your kitchen. So set some time aside because you can make this yourself without any problem at all. And especially if you have seen my video on how to make croissants, this is a far simpler recipe to start with in case you want to practice your lamination skills. So I've got some flour here. I put it in a bowl directly and I'm creating kind of a well in the center. You can do this directly on your counter. You could use a stand-up mixer as well if you are kind of pressed for time. Now you might have noticed that I'm not adding all of the flour and the water that I quote in my recipe. And I do this even if it's my own recipe because I need to make sure that everything is well in agreement with my environment. If I'm working in my kitchen but it's suddenly very humid outside, it turns out that I might not need as much liquid in my dough. So I just tend to add these things at the very end if I really need them. So that's a great tip for any dough that you're working with. So now I'm gonna add, so I've got some water, some flour, and some salt, and to that I just added a little tiny bit of butter. And I'm just kneading this really well until I get a nice and smooth dough. And one way to tell if the dough has been kneaded long enough is to stretch it out a little bit. And if you can get it very thinly stretched without tearing it, then you know that the dough has been kneaded enough and you can let it rest. So I'm gonna cover mine up with some cling film and I'm gonna let this sit in my fridge for about 20 to 30 minutes. The butter in the dough is going to harden up and that's going to make it much easier to work with. And also it gives me time to get everything ready for the lamination steps. Now a little flour on your counter because we're going to roll this out. Now for puff pastry, I don't like being super precise in terms of dimensions. I'm just trying to roll out a rectangle here. And I've pre-prepared my butter into a nice square, or it could even be a rectangle. And I'm using for the butter a 14 by 12 centimeter slab. And I'm just trying to roll my dough to any dimension within my rectangular shape, any dimension that can encapsulate the slab of butter. Now, if you are a complete beginner to lamination, then I will add a link to my croissant video in the description box. I will add the link with the actual timestamp so that you know exactly any dimensions and things like that that are not so obvious for people who are just getting started with the whole lamination process. So the idea is to enclose butter with dough. That is step number one. So I'm just placing the butter right in the center of my dough rectangle and folding the sides that stick out into the butter again. And this is called a book fold. So what we're trying to do is kind of join the ends of the dough in the center and tuck any sort of visible butter into that dough. Tuck it in, pinch it with your fingers, add a little bit of flour because we're going to roll this out along that seam line. And you want to make sure that the butter is at the right temperature. It has to be flexible enough for it not to break during the rolling process. But here we go. So again, for puff pastry, the main thing is to have a certain amount of folds. And there are many ways in which you can fold your dough. Now I talk about folds and the different ones that exist in the croissant video, and I don't want to repeat myself too much in this video, but this is a double fold, what I'm doing here. And it's going to give me 4 layers. And what I'm trying to do in the end is build about 1000 layers. So I can achieve this by turning the dough 90 degrees with each of the folds that I make. So now I'm going to roll along the fold line and create another fold, and so on and so forth. So I'm doing, this is a single fold where we fold a third of the dough onto itself, and then the other third comes on top. And again, you can, if the dough is too soft, you can pop it in the fridge or the freezer for a few minutes until it's more workable, and then you start again. And I'm gonna repeat this twice actually, because like I said, I'm trying to get something along 1000 layers in here. So again, I'm gonna make a double turn. So let's recap. We've done a double fold and a single fold. The double fold gives us 4 layers. The single fold gives us 3 layers. So that would be 12. Now I'm doing another double fold. So 4 times 12 and so on and so forth. I hope that gives you sort of a guideline of how many layers we're building here. And you could even ask, can I just make as many as I can? And the answer is you can, but the butter can only be rolled so much and so thin before it starts to blend into the dough. So I wouldn't recommend going for anything more than 1000 layers. So my last 2 folds will be singles. And once I'm done with that, then your puff pastry is ready to be rolled into whatever shape you want. So for the video, I'm actually just rolling a rectangle as thin as 2 millimeters in thickness. And I'm gonna put this directly onto my baking tray for it to bake into just this random shape that I will later cut into more specific things. So okay, we've placed that onto the baking sheet, and I'm adding some icing sugar directly on top, and this is going to give it a nice shine. And a little trick is to cover that with parchment or a silicone mat and placing another baking tray on top so that it bakes at an even thickness. After about 20 minutes, you can remove the tray and the silicone mat in my case. I'm going to do another dusting of icing sugar as evenly as possible all over the surface. And I'm going to return this to the oven for a few more minutes for it to get a nice and golden brown color all over. So once you see that it's got this beautiful golden amber color on top, then you know that it's done. And you'll see some really great caramelization, hopefully at the top. And of course, if you wanted to, you could have baked this into a more defined shape like a circle, and the process would be the same. I'm just making little tiny rectangles to build sort of a mille feuille. And I've got some diplomat cream in there. Now here's an example of what happens if you use a weight during the baking process, which is what I'm showing you here. You get a very nice and defined thickness, which is great for layering desserts. But if you don't use a weight during the baking process and you let this expand wildly in the oven, then you get this obvious layering effect, which is also rather beautiful if you ask me. So you have those 2 options. So I hope you enjoyed this recipe and you learned a few tricks also on how to make your own puff pastry. You see that it's not very difficult and it's very satisfying. If you liked this video, please don't forget to hit the like button, to subscribe, and to share for more. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.